Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to do something kind of mind-bending. We are going to reveal the invisible rules that completely govern how almost all of us have been taught to read. Think back to your literature classes for a second. You probably thought you were just, reading a book, talking about the characters, and maybe trying to hit a word count on a paper. But right underneath those basic assignments was a massive, silent framework of rules.
So, let's kick this off by asking a pretty provocative question. What is really happening when we sit down to analyze a great book? We usually just assume we're extracting meaning from the words on the page, right? But the truth is, when we learn to study literature, we aren't just memorizing vocabulary or facts about authors. We're actually, quietly, absorbing a very specific set of values and assumptions about the world. It's honestly like a software program running in the background of your brain every single time you open a novel. And today, we are going to look straight at the source code.
Literary theorist Peter Barry describes this phenomenon beautifully. He calls it a half-hidden curriculum, a distilled essence that is simultaneously pervasive and invisible. This brilliant quote perfectly captures how traditional literary studies embed specific values so deeply in our minds that we just mistake them for mere common sense. We don't even realize we're applying a theory because the theory just feels like the natural way to read.
Well, we finally have a name for this hidden matrix we've been operating in all these years: liberal humanism. This is the traditional, dominant approach to studying literature that held absolute sway before modern critical theory came along. It was the absolute standard. If you practiced literary criticism and didn't call yourself a Marxist or a structuralist or a feminist critic, then you were practicing liberal humanism. It masquerades as this untheorized approach, but as we are about to see, it actually relies on 10 highly specific, deeply ingrained tenets.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that by naming these unstated tenets, we realize that our default way of reading is just as much a constructed theory as any modern academic framework. No ways of studying literature are theory-free. Literally, even the decision to just focus on the words on the page is a theoretical choice. By pulling back the curtain on liberal humanism, we can finally see the gears turning in our own heads. Let's dive right into theme 1, the text and time. All right, let's start breaking down these 10 invisible tenets of liberal humanism. The very first assumption, tenet 1, is that a truly great book basically transcends the era it was written in to speak to something constant in humanity. Think about how often you've heard the phrase that Shakespeare is not for an age, but for all time. Traditional criticism absolutely insists that if a book is truly great literature, it sheds all its historical baggage and speaks directly across the centuries to the core of who we are. And I love this, because the poet Ezra Pound famously defined literature as exactly that: news which stays news. Liberal humanism demands that true literature isn't just some historical artifact that you stick in a museum case. No, it remains fresh, urgent, and relevant forever. If a book only matters because of the politics of its specific decade, well, the traditionalist would argue it's just not great art. Which brings us to the second tenet. This one dictates exactly how we're supposed to interact with that timeless text. The belief here is that a text contains its own meaning entirely isolated from outside contexts. According to this unstated rule, you really don't need to know the socio-political background of the French Revolution to understand a poem from that era. You don't need to know the literary influences, and you certainly do not need to go reading the author's diary. The text is treated as a self-sufficient island. This is exactly what leads to the classic practice of on-site close reading, where you're handed a poem completely unseen and expected to explicate it using nothing but your own mind and the words right there on the page. And that leads seamlessly into the third tenet, perfectly summed up by the 19th century critic Matthew Arnold. He argued the true business of criticism is, quote, to see the object as in itself it really is. See, liberal humanism demands we completely detach the text from all prior ideological expectations. We're supposed to approach the book with total neutrality, achieving a pure, unaided close reading that isn't infected by our own modern biases or political agendas. Moving right along to theme 2, humanity and morality. So, if a book transcends time and exists in total isolation, it has to be speaking to an audience that shares a fundamental, unchanging core, right? Well, there it is, in Tenet 4. Liberal humanism operates on the massive assumption that human nature is essentially unchanging. It assumes the passions, emotions, and situations experienced by a Greek soldier in antiquity are fundamentally the exact same as those experienced by a modern-day office worker. Because of this, traditional criticism values continuity in literature way more than mere novelty. Fun fact,
Samuel Johnson once famously dismissed a novel simply because it was too novel, too original. For these critics, the goal isn't to invent something completely new, but to perfectly express what has always been felt. And this directly informs another major rule, the moral purpose of literature. Liberal humanism draws a really hard line between art and propaganda. Traditional critics believe literature should organically enhance our lives with humane values. It should make us more empathetic. What it absolutely should not do is hit us over the head with overt political messaging. As the poet John Keats noted, we tend to distrust literature that has a palpable design upon us, meaning we actively reject stories that feel like they're obviously trying to preach to us or convert us to a specific political viewpoint.
Next up is theme 3, form, sincerity, and action. So, how exactly should a writer put words on the page to achieve this kind of timeless moral art? Well, Tenets 7 and 8 tackle the actual mechanics of writing. Traditional criticism argues you can't just slap imagery onto a story like icing on a cake. The form and the content have to fuse organically. And how do we know if an author is genuinely being sincere? For a liberal humanist, you don't go checking the author's biography. Sincerity resides deep within the language itself. You prove it by avoiding tired cliches, by understating emotion, and by letting feelings emerge naturally from the text, rather than screaming them at the reader. Which brings us to Tenet 9, the famous show, don't tell rule. Traditional English studies reveal a massive distrust of abstract ideas. They strongly prefer words that silently mime, demonstrate, or act out their meaning. They want concrete embodiment, tactile enactment, sensuous immediacy. If an author just stops the narrative dead in its tracks to give you a 3-page philosophical essay explaining their abstract ideas, yeah, the traditional critic views that as a massive failure of literary art. This profound distrust of abstract theory completely culminates in our 10th tenet, which proves that traditional criticism is actually deeply rooted in English empiricism. Tracing all the way back to the philosopher John Locke, this is the determination to trust only what is made evident to the senses. Just as Locke rejected introspective speculation in favor of direct evidence, the traditional critic rejects theoretical speculation in favor of the direct, sensory experience of reading the text. They believe that bringing your own preconceived ideas or theories to a book just gets in the way of the pure experience of the words. Finally, let's look at why this matters. Okay, so we've mapped out the rules of the matrix. We've unpacked the 10 tenets of liberal humanism. But why does exposing these deeply buried academic assumptions actually matter to you, right now, as a reader? Well, the crucial takeaway is that what we so often mistake for basic common sense is actually a highly specific ideological choice. By insisting that literature has no politics, liberal humanism is inherently taking a political stance. By insisting that human nature never changes, it's making a massive philosophical claim. Every reading method has a bias, but once you identify these assumptions as choices rather than universal truths, you are finally free. Naming the limits of liberal humanism gives you the power to question the very foundation of how we judge art. I want to leave you with this provocative thought as we wrap up this explainer. Now that you know the hidden curriculum, you kind of can't unsee it. So will you still read looking for timeless, unchanging human nature? Or will you start looking for the specific historical, political, and social forces hiding right there in the margins of the page? One thing is for sure, the way you consume stories will literally never be quite the same again. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking the big questions.